right. I think we can go ahead and get started, Matt.
All right. And should we do a round of introductions? Because some of us, I think, are maybe new to the group or weren't at the last couple meetings. So maybe we can start with that. And I'll start. I'm Matt Hasty with Angela Planning Group. Although I've been telling people this week, our firm is actually merging with another firm. So now I'm with Angela Planning Group / MIG. So that's kind of new news. So you guys are not the very first to hear it, but you're early. But it doesn't really change like who's working on the project or what we're doing for you. It's changes my email address in a few days, but that's that. So I'm the project manager. I'm gonna kick it over to Kate Rogers, and we'll just kind of go around the screen, and whoever is next, pick the next person, and we'll do that till we hear from everybody.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Kate Rogers. I'm with APG / MIG. I'm a planner, excuse me, and I helped work on the housing strategies report. And if you have to excuse me, my voice is coming and going today. So I think Matt's going to do most of the talking today, I hope, but you might hear my froggy voice a little bit today too. And I will pass it over to Brendan.
Thanks. I'm Brendan Buckley. I'm with Johnson Economics. We were part of the consulting team partnered with APG on this project, and we helped with some of the technical pieces with the housing projections in the last phase, and are advising a bit on real estate markets and those type of dynamics for this phase. Taylor?
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Taylor Campy. I'm the planning manager for Estacada. And I have met or at least communicated with most of you, but yeah, to the new members or people who are filling in for our missing members, it's really great to have you here with us, and thank you so much for your time. And I'll pass it to Denise.
Hi, I'm Denise Carey. I'm the city manager at Estacada for one more day, but I will be participating hopefully to see this through. And I'm just really excited to get this done and see our updates to our comp plan and mostly our comp plan, because it's been a while since we have done a housing update. So I'll pass it over to Melanie.
Hi there, I'm Melanie Wagner. I'm the Assistant City Manager in the City of Estacada, and I will be the interim City Manager until the council appoints somebody to that position, fill that role. And so I'm excited to be part of this project, and it's a little hectic around here right now, but that's all right. Thank you. And how about Elena?
Hi, Elena Turpin. I just started like 2 weeks ago, but the Community Development Coordinator for the City of Estacada. So most of you people are all new to me. So nice to meet you. And I'll pass it to Katie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Dunsmuir. I'm a city councilor in Estacada. Housing has been my #1 priority and focus since I took my seat 3 years ago. I've been an apartment manager for the last 9 years in the Portland metro area, managing mom and pop or market rate apartments, as well as low income tax credit housing in Milwaukee for a couple of years. So this means a lot to me, and I'm really excited to hear what you guys are working on, and see if I can't provide any insight and keep this conversation going forward. So thank you for everything you guys are doing.
Awesome. I'm gonna pick on Matt Day because he unmuted himself.
Go ahead, Matt.
Hi, can you? Yep. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties today, but
oops, now you're muted.
You just muted yourself. There you go. Nope.
You're muted again.
You're muted again.
We're unmuted for a second, and we could hear you for a second.
There we
go. There you go.
Okay.
There you go.
Sorry, having computer issues today. Dialed in on my phone, and anyways, on that day, I work for Reliance Connects, the voice and internet provider, facilities-based provider in Estacada and Eagle Creek surrounding areas.
Carlos, do you want to go next?
Yes, can you hear me? So my name is Carlos Romero, and I'm a case manager with the Estacada Food Bank here in Estacada. And I'm coordinating and running the warming and cooling shelter here in town. So it's good to be here. Thank you.
All right. Let's see, who do we still have? Kimberlee and Ben, I think, and Deborah, or maybe the last three.
And Anne.
And Anne, sorry, Anne. We can go in that order. Kimberlee, Ben, Deborah, Anne.
Hi, folks. My name is Kimberlee Abels. I'm running around doing the working mom thing at the moment, but making it work. I live in Estacada. I volunteer on a variety of Estacada committees and work groups and different kinds of things. So just here to kind of bring the community member perspective.
Ben, go ahead.
Hang on. There I am. Hey, Ben Wheeler in my truck like normal, bouncing around. What am I? I'm a community member, school board member, planning commission chair, a few other things, probably aren't that important, and glad to be on the committee. And the other thing is I got to be off at 4:30 because I got a wrestling match. Not me, but my son, so.
All right, Deborah. And yep, you're next.
Okay.
It's not Deborah.
I'm not Deborah. No, I need to change that obviously on the computer. So my name is Jenny Bedoin. I'm the new executive director at the food bank in Estacada. I'm also I grew up here in Estacada. I am a business owner in Estacada. I own a restaurant. I'm on the Downtown Estacada Commission, at least for a little longer. This is literally my first week here as executive director at the food bank. So I'm kind of overwhelmed right now, but I'm working very closely with Carlos. He's been our lead for the warming shelter, like he shared. So him and I are kind of a team. So thanks for having me. We're open right now to the community, serving some clients. So I'm going to kind of keep my mask on, and I might have to step out every once in a while, but I'm going to try to be here as much as possible. Okay.
Hi, I'm Ann Schweitzer Johnson. I work with Todos Juntos, and as Kayla is not with us any longer, she's working for another nonprofit in Gresham, but I'm going to be hopping onto this committee. And I grew up in Estacada, moved away, came back, glad to be serving here. So I'm going to be listening in and trying to learn all the acronyms. So I'll be writing a lot of notes here. Thanks.
Awesome. That was everybody, yeah? I think
we did it all. Yep.
Cool. All right. Well, it's great to see all of you here. Really appreciate you giving your time to us today, and we'll try to use it as well as we can. We're going to, Kate's going to share a presentation on the screen, and we'll spend the rest of the time going through that, but we're not going to just like give a presentation for the whole time and then talk. I think what we'll do is we'll cover the first few slides, and then we're going to spend our time talking about a number of different specific types of strategies to help the city of Estacada and community members in Estacada meet their housing needs. And so we'll take it kind of a strategy at a time. I'll cover the first few slides, but then after each strategy, each slide, we'll just stop and see if y'all have any comments or questions. There will probably be some acronyms. I will do my best to describe what the acronyms mean if I use them. So yeah, we'll take it from there. So next one. So did introductions. We'll give you just kind of a quick status report in a moment in terms of where we are in the project. And then again, the bulk of this meeting is to talk about the strategies and initial recommendations that are in the strategies report that we prepared in advance of this meeting. Then we'll talk about next steps, and then we'll finish up by 6 p.m. It's possible we'll finish sooner than that, but it's a pretty big group, and we do have a lot of information to cover. It's fairly technical. So we'll just do our best, and but we will also do our best to let you go by 6, because we appreciate giving us 2 hours, and we don't want to take up more time than that if we can help it. So, all right. So just in terms of overview of the process and where we are now, we started this process out with a couple of pieces of technical analysis. So the first was to project future needs for different types of housing within Estacada and within not just the city limits, but the urban growth boundary. And Brendan mentioned that earlier. His firm did that work. And at the same time, we looked at what's the supply of what we call buildable land within the urban growth boundary, and to accommodate housing overall, as well as different types of housing. What we generally found, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, was that there's enough land in total to accommodate the projected future needs in Estacada. But there's kind of an imbalance of land zoned to meet certain types of needs. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that informs some of the strategies that we want to talk about. The other thing, so that was kind of that residential land needs analysis, comparing or reconciling the demand and supply. That was that next step. The other thing I'll note is just that when we looked at projecting housing needs forward over the next 20 years, the state of Oregon requires that all cities in Oregon base those projections on population projections that are prepared by the Portland State University Population and Research Center. So everybody's got to use those. Those are the official projections. We think those are actually probably low for Estacada, given how much growth you've seen in the last several years, and what you're currently seeing. So we also kind of did a little bit of an alternative projection. You know, if we saw some higher rates of growth, would there still be enough land? We think there would be. So land supply is not so much the issue, but the zoning of land and how land can be developed in Estacada is more of an issue. And that's sort of what we're going to be focusing on in part in terms of thinking about these different housing strategies. So that's kind of a quick update of a lot of work that we did earlier in the process. And if people have questions, about that, let me know. But there's a bunch of technical analysis and reports behind that work to get us to now this stage of looking at, okay, what are the strategies that the city can undertake with partners, because the city doesn't control all the factors related to how housing is built and developed and priced over time. So anything, when we talk about the city, it's really not just the city, but the city with partners at other agencies, in the development community, in the nonprofit community, et cetera. So it's kind of the city maybe with like really the community is what I should say. So in terms of this housing strategy task, we've prepared an initial report that gets into actually a decent amount of detail around a number of these strategies, but our next step will be to prepare a revised report that gets into even a little more detail, and particularly around strategies that we have identified or will continue to identify as sort of the highest priority or most effective or constructive strategies. So this is our chance to say, hey, we've done some initial work. Here's what we found so far. Here's what we're recommending, and then get some feedback from all of you about, yeah, that makes sense to move forward on that, or hey, I'm not really sure. Have you thought about doing it this way, et cetera. So if any of y'all have comments, we just like to hear all comments and questions, but particularly we've identified some priorities. I'll talk about that in a minute. And if you have any thoughts on whether things should be lower or higher priorities, we'd be interested in that too. And we'll be sort of continuing to think about that as we move forward in the project. So that was more than I thought I was going to see on this slide, but I wanted to give you a sort of reasonable background on where we are right now. Any quick questions about the where we are in the process before I move on? Okay, and I and also Kate and Taylor, we'll all kind of keep our eyes open for the little raised hand symbols on the screen, or you like physically raising your hand. You can try that. I can't see everybody on my screen. But if you do have a question or comment, those are the sort of two ways to let us know. All right, next one. So this is our project schedule. I won't spend too much time on this. I'll just kind of note, it also sort of shows you where we are in the process. It shows you that final housing strategy report that, as I say, will go into more detail about some of these strategies where, for instance, we've identified some potential changes to the city zoning ordinance or development code. We will draft some proposed language, not in every case, but in a number of cases. So there will be more work on that. I'll talk about some of the other stuff in terms of community meeting. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. After we've had that community meeting and done some more work on the strategies, we will have our next meeting of this group. Ultimately, kind of at the end of the process, in addition to describing these strategies and the steps that the city would take to move forward with them, we will be preparing an update of the housing element or chapter of the city's comprehensive plan. So that's another kind of key outcome of this process, just to mention. So, and we're scheduled to finish up in approximately June, July of this year. All right. So before we start on the strategies, I'm going to have Brendan cover the slide and talk about some interviews we had with some developers, as well as some financial analysis that he's done around the cost of housing and the financial feasibility of different types of housing. So I'll stop. I will not steal any more of his thunder, and I'll let him cover this one.
Thanks. Yeah, so as part of this, part of the project, coming up with the strategies, we took an extra look at some of the feasibility of building housing in Estacada and talked to some developers as part of that process to get their feedback on what they'd found. We were able to talk to a couple of developers who have quite a bit of experience building in Estacada. We talked to a developer who has been looking for sites and has some experience with trying to build some multifamily in Estacada without success so far. And so we got a lot of really great insights that feed into the recommendations we'll be talking about in a minute. But some of the overarching issues are that right now the cost of building in Estacada relative to the achievable rents makes building some types of housing kind of difficult. You know that you've seen plenty of single family subdivision type development. Obviously there's not a big issue there, but there has been some issues with getting the multifamily. So part of the problem there is that Estacada, as part of sort of a broader region and really the extended metro region, you're going to face some of the same costs as a developer would face, much closer into the Portland metro area. The materials and so on and labor and so on is going to cost the same, even though it's a little bit removed. So that's one of the challenges. The other challenge that came up is just having sites available and places to build. So really having properly zoned land and sites available, which is a major part of this, the process we're going through with this project to talk about the availability of lands and where your different residential zones apply. And then the other thing we got a lot of feedback on, and it really is going to feed into what we're going to talk about next, is a lot of sort of specific examples of where some of the standards in the development code and the requirements sort of result in kind of unrealistic or even in some cases kind of contradictory requirements that make development hard to do. So through our feasibility analysis that we did, we ran running some models, some pro forma models. We identified some of the same things that some of the standards, particularly around density, site size, and so on, really present challenges to getting some of the type of housing development you might like to see, including the missing middle housing types. So that's an overview. A lot of that is going to feed into what we talk about next. Matt, were there other aspects of the interviews in particular you wanted me to touch on?
No, I think that pretty well covers it. The one thing I'll do is just quickly define missing middle housing. When we say missing middle housing, we're generally talking about duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and also townhomes. And then there's another form of housing that we kind of lump in there that's called cottage cluster housing, which is sort of smaller, detached homes that surround a common open space or sort of a courtyard. So that's kind of what we mean when we talk about middle housing. And we'll talk about that under one of the strategies coming up a little bit. But I just would note that. And just, does anybody have any questions for Brendan, kind of recognizing that we'll talk about some of these findings and what we do with some of those findings in terms of recommendations a little later? All right, well, Brendan will be with us for the duration today, so he can, if we have questions for him as we move forward, we can check in with him. All right, so draft recommendations that we're going to talk about for pretty much the rest of the meeting, except for the last slide, I think. First, we've got some recommendations around your comprehensive plan policies. And again, as one of the outcomes of this project, we will be drafting updated comprehensive plan policy language, as well as some kind of narrative, a narrative summary of what we found during this process that'll feed into that. And then we've got a set of housing strategies, and we've categorized them by these in these four ways: land supply, policy and development code strategies, incentives, and then funding sources and programs. In each case, we've identified an initial priority, high, medium, or low. That was primarily driven by staff and the consulting team, kind of taking a first shot at that, but also the Committee for Housing, Affordability, and Diversity or Development. I always get
That's right, diversity. And
diversity.
also, Kimberlee's got her hand up.
Yes, I was going to finish this slide and then get to Kimberlee. Yes, yeah. So yes, Kimberlee, one sec. I just wanted to talk about the priorities, and then I'll get to you. So we've got some initial priorities. We had some discussion with this group at the last meeting and also with council at a briefing. We made some tweaks based on that, but we will continue to ask you all about priorities. So that's it on just kind of this. Yeah, Kimberlee, sorry to keep you waiting there.
No problem. That's why I raised my hand and wait. I can't remember how we've looked at this before, but I'm curious if we're just looking at building types, like multifamily versus townhome versus single family, or if we're also looking at like share of rental market. I'm thinking, in triplexes or duplexes, they can be purchased or rented. And so I'm just wondering how we are balancing that additional variable, or if that's for another conversation.
That's a great question. I'll do my best to answer it, and then we might also see if Brendan has anything to add. So a couple things. When we did those housing needs projections, we did projections based on both owner-occupied housing and rental housing. So we identified what's the long-term need or demand for those two different types of housing. And that then does feed into housing type in terms of building type. In terms of how the city regulates or zones or land for housing, it really does focus on type. The cities are not really supposed to regulate whether somebody can own or rent their own home. And so our strategies to a large degree focus on housing type, but they can have sort of differing impacts on whether or not that housing is primarily owner occupied or renter occupied. So we did look at that in terms of demand. And certainly there's some implications in terms of the strategies, in terms of, you know, how they affect development of owner occupied or renter occupied housing. So did that help? Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I feel like the more we see these developments coming up with HOAs and, you know, they don't even allow for rental for a home. And so I'm just trying to think how we can also build in to somehow build up our rental availability, because we know that's one of our huge spaces that's lacking is that rental home piece.
Yeah, and I think definitely when we talk about some of these strategies, a lot of them really are focused on kind of reducing barriers to or making it easier to develop some of those more typically rental forms of housing. So multifamily, plexes, et cetera. You know, townhomes are often owner occupied, but they can also be rented. So we definitely have that in mind, because we know that's an issue in Estacada for sure, in terms of where the gaps have been in terms of production of housing. So yeah, great point. Okay, so go on to the next one and we'll dive in, and then we'll just kind of take it a slide at a time in terms of I'll summarize what's on the slide. Kate will correct me if I get anything wrong. Brendan will chime in if he has anything to add, and then we just want to get your feedback on all this stuff. So I'll kind of pause at the end of each slide and just see if anybody has anything to add or any questions or et cetera. So I talked a little bit about comprehensive plan amendments earlier. So your existing comprehensive plan really addresses, you know, many of the housing needs and issues that we have identified up to this point. Although we do think there are some policies that either there's some gaps or there's some things that could be strengthened within your comprehensive plan policies. And so we will ultimately be recommending some updates, some amendments to the policies in your plan. And this slide summarizes very generally what some of those would be. So either adding policies or policy language around encouraging development of housing that's affordable to low and moderate income households, supporting partnerships with other entities, particularly nonprofit developers and other public agencies, to help support, again, some of those same forms of housing, including some policy language around being consistent with the goals of the Federal Fair Housing Act. That's something that we generally just recommend cities include as policy language in their plans. Being explicit about supporting development of a variety of housing, so multifamily housing or apartments, middle housing, accessory dwelling units, other types of housing, support for rehabilitation of existing housing, because a lot of times, you know, you've got housing that right now is reasonably affordable to the folks who live in it, but it might need some repairs or rehab for them to remain living there. And so supporting that is a way to support existing affordable housing as opposed to building new housing that might cost more to build. And then finally, just making sure that the city continues to monitor the supply of land and how that impacts the ability to provide housing there. So some policy language around that. So that's kind of what we've identified so far in terms of strengthening some of the policies in your comp plan. And because it's just important to have a good foundation, policy foundation in that plan that then supports the strategies that you ultimately want to implement as a community. So again, I will stop there. Any questions about that? Any further thoughts? Yeah, Melanie.
I just had a quick question, because I thought, and maybe you know, when you think you're doing a really good job at something and then you find out that was just average maybe. But I thought that we'd been really working on making sure that ADUs were proactive about getting ADUs into the community and allowing for that, and rezoning things so that there can be more multifamily. Also allowing for smaller lot sizes, thinking that then the houses would cost less, but yet they still build a relatively large single family home that's still pretty expensive. And so I guess I wanted to say, I thought we were doing pretty good, but I'm excited to hear what your comments are going to be on how we can make that better. just because there's apparently more that we need to do. So.
Yeah, and I think you have done a lot of things that have been really beneficial. So I don't want to, I guess I should start out by sort of saying, yes, you should get credit for that. And it's true. On some of these policy language things, you are doing some of these things already. It's just that your comprehensive plan policies related to housing don't always explicitly talk about some of the things that you are doing or that you could do a better job of doing. And so what we're talking about is, on this slide at least, is updating the policy language to make sure it supports the things you're already doing and the other things you want to do. So yeah,
Perfect.
question. And then we will talk about other things that we think you can do more of or better at. We go through here.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Katie has a comment or a question.
I really just wanted to piggyback off of what Melanie was saying about, like, we've already given some people exceptions on like lot sizes was I think a great example that she brought up, because there's a housing development that I can actually think of where we cut the zoned lot size in more than half under the guise of affordable housing. We can sell these houses for a more affordable price when the cost of land is less. But those 1,200 or 1,300 square foot homes on the 3,500 square foot lots are still starting at $400,000. So I'm really looking forward to not only hearing what the recommendations are moving forward, but also how we can actually hold the developers accountable to the promises that they make when we give them exceptions like that. So, but when Melanie brought that up, it rang a bunch of bells in my head, and I just really wanted to piggyback that's a really important, I think, focus that I also have. And I just wanted to say thank you for bringing that up, Melanie, because as a city, we've been trying, and I feel like we've been burned with a couple of these strategies already. So really excited to hear about how we can actually hold developers accountable to when we say affordable, and this is why we're giving you this exception. So just really wanting to hear what you guys have to say.
Okay, great thought and comment. And as we go through here, I'll talk about that where I can, where that's applicable. I will say that some of the things we're recommending, we would recommend that you do sort of throughout the city or throughout specific zones. That's different than providing an incentive or a kind of something specific to an individual developer. But again, I will sort of talk about that, and where you're simply updating your zoning ordinance to allow for smaller lot sizes or less parking, it does not always guarantee that the housing is going to be less expensive or affordable to people in a certain income range. I mean, you're absolutely right about that. And so we'll talk about some areas where you could, as you say, hold a developer accountable, but in a lot of cases, you can't exactly require it in that way. So again, it's a great comment, but I don't want to overpromise, I guess what I'm maybe saying. So I'll try to discern between those things as we go through this. All right, anybody else before we jump into the rest of these? Okay. So one of the strategies, so again, this is the first of the land supply strategies, rezoning land. So as I said a little bit earlier, one of the things we found was sort of an imbalance between how much land you have zoned for certain types of housing. So in total, you appear to have enough land to meet that 20 years of housing, but you've got a limited supply of land that's zoned for multifamily housing or apartments. And you're kind of like right on the edge of having enough for the next 20 years under those kind of baseline projections. You do have capacity in some of your mixed use zones, but in those places, housing is not necessarily the primary use. There's no guarantee in the mixed use zones that you're going to get housing development on some of those properties. So we think one of the things you may want to look at in combination with some of these other strategies is possibly rezoning some land from lower density to higher density designations, from R1 to either R2 or R3. So that's one thing to think about. We'll talk about some other things later in terms of ensuring that if you do rezone that land, it doesn't just get developed for lower density forms of housing, because that won't kind of solve your problem. I will talk about expanding the UGB in just a moment as well. I see a thing in the chat. That's one of the strategies in here. I think it might be the next one. You know, if you are thinking about rezoning, very generally or somewhat generically, we tell communities, think about doing that in proximity to existing high density areas, or at least medium density areas. So we've got a little more of a transition between areas. Do it in areas that have proximity to services for people, services, shopping opportunities, et cetera. Think about the size and ownership of the areas in terms of it just being more efficient to develop somewhat larger parcels for that type of housing. So if you rezone a bunch of really small parcels, it's going to require some land consolidation, property consolidation, typically to make it efficient to develop some multifamily housing in those areas. So those are just some things to think about in terms of implementing the strategy. So let's see, and again, I will talk about UGB stuff in a minute, but any comments, questions? We identified this one, at least initially, as a medium priority, but I would almost say medium high, given the results of the housing needs projection and kind of buildable lands inventory work we did here. All right, so on all of these, I'll see if you have any questions, and if you don't, we'll just kind of keep going. Katie, did you have a question?
I do. So we actually just rezoned a lot of land. We redid our comprehensive map back in 2019. I think we finalized it in 2020. Is it possible for you guys to help us actually like identify which land specifically you think would be the best candidates for us to rezone the higher densities?
We can give you some suggestions around that. Yeah. I mean, I think so. We've got like 18 strategies here. And we can do a certain amount of additional work on some, but probably not all of these strategies, just kind of with the resources we have. If this for you all is you think it's a particularly important thing, a higher priority strategy, yeah, we can give you some guidance around the areas we think would make sense. And you're right, you did update your zoning code to allow a variety of housing types in some land that previously did not allow for them. That's a little different. But those zones also allow for some other things, I think. So based on the work we did, we still think you might want to look at some rezoning to R2 or R3. But Taylor, do you have anything to add to that?
Nope, I think you covered it.
Okay, awesome. Okay, let me go to the next one.
I guess I would just, yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on this, but this is where it's going to be really helpful to get feedback from you all and at the upcoming council briefing about, yeah, whether those prioritizations that we've got on here, you know, medium, low, high, do those seem right? Do you think that something should be higher priority? Because those are the things that the team will, you know, do a deeper dive into and come back with, you know, if we want the rezoning land to be a higher priority on this list, then yeah, they can come back with some more detailed recommendations on that. But if we find that, you know, maybe these other 5 strategies are the highest priorities, then we're going to have them dive more deeply into those, if that makes sense. So just wanted to make that clear.
Yep. And somebody just asked in the chat to if I could define R2 and R3. So your zoning designations, R1 is kind of the lowest density zoning designation. It, for the most part, just allows for single family detached housing. R2 is your medium density designation. It allows for a wider range of housing, but not all types, at least as outright permitted use. R3 is your highest density residential designation. All of those have different standards in terms of either what's allowed and whether it's allowed outright or as what's called a conditional use, and different standards in terms of minimum lot size and some other standards. Those are kind of the key ones, frankly, what you allow and on what size lots and or densities of housing. So yeah, really good question. Thank you for making sure I define that one. All right, now we'll go to the next one and answer the question about UGB expansion. So what we found, given that that the analysis that we did showed that you have an adequate supply of land to meet those long-term housing needs, you would have a very difficult time, frankly, justifying an urban growth boundary expansion, given the findings that we found through that earlier analysis. So there's really not the kind of basis to support that as an option. It could be that you need that in the future. Certainly, if you see growth at higher rates than what's currently being projected, that may be something that you need or want to look at sooner rather than later. But at this point, all urban growth boundary expansions, there's a lot of rules and regulations around those. They ultimately have to be acknowledged by the state. And before any city looks at amending its urban growth boundary, they need to look at what are called efficiency measures. So how can you use land in the existing urban growth boundary more efficiently? And so I will not say absolutely no, but I will say very unlikely that you could justify an urban growth boundary expansion. And frankly, that's not where I would put my effort if I was you, or if I was recommending where to put your effort. So, so we identified that as a low initial priority, given the outcome of the analysis that we did so far. Yeah. So I don't have anything more to say about that, but any other questions about that? Did I answer the question? Can't remember who asked it. Okay, so we'll go to number 3. So one of the things you can look at to kind of allow for development and make development of certain types of housing that you're not seeing at least more financially feasible. It doesn't, again, guarantee that housing is going to get developed in a certain price range, but it does make it more feasible to develop overall, is to allow for either increased densities or smaller lot sizes. And as Katie mentioned, and Taylor also mentioned, you have done that in certain areas. We still think there's some room to allow for either, again, higher densities or reduced minimum lot sizes in the R2, R3, and residential mixed use zones, based on both us just kind of looking at your code in comparison with other codes, and us sort of thinking about what's realistic as a minimum lot size or a lot size to develop a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex, townhomes, et cetera. And also the pro forma analysis, the financial feasibility analysis that Brendan did earlier also supports this. We think there's some room to reduce those lot sizes in those zones. We think in your R1 zone, it's probably for the most part, pretty reasonable, the lot sizes you have, but in R2 and R3, in the residential mixed use zones, we think there's some room for some changes in that regard. Again, it provides the opportunity or the ability to build housing at lower costs. It doesn't necessarily guarantee that it will be provided or sold at those lower costs. And I think that's just important to recognize. And we have some pretty specific initial recommendations in the draft report that we sent you all in terms of where we might suggest you go or start in terms of changes to some of those minimum lot sizes or densities. And this was identified as a relatively high priority because it will make it at least more financially feasible to develop some of those types of housing that you're not seeing here in some of those zones. So I'm gonna stop, see if either Kate or Brendan have anything to add, and then just see if anybody has any questions.
I would just add, in case it wasn't already clear, I think this strategy really focuses less on single family detached housing and more so on that missing middle category that's kind of between single family and multifamily, but then also multifamily development. So it's really about making those housing types that Estacada isn't seeing enough of, making those more feasible to develop. So it's not necessarily getting at the issue I think that Katie brought up per se, although that could be something that the city also considers looking at more broadly. And if you suggest that we kind of extend this recommendation to single family, then we can take a look at that too.
But we do in our code, we made some code revisions to allow for those different types of middle housing, like cottage clusters and that type of thing. We have those, Taylor, am I correct, in the new zones that we did. But again, the comprehensive plan doesn't really have the strategies to back that up.
Yeah, that's right. And it's also in the older zones, the minimum lot sizes for some of those, middle housing types, so like duplexes or triplexes or common wall, townhomes, the lot sizes, first of all, the calculation for the lot sizes for
right
those, especially for multifamily, gets just really wonky and
yep.
Hard for staff and applicants alike to use. And two, there are, like, I'm thinking of in the R1 zone, you can have a duplex in that zone if as a conditional use, but the minimum lot size for a duplex is 8,000 square feet, where the minimum lot size for a single family home is 7,500 square feet. So it's a very small difference in lot size, but with all these subdivisions coming in, we're seeing them plat lots as small as they can. So you're getting lots that are pretty much exactly 7,500 square feet. And then if someone, wants to put a duplex there, they're not allowed to because they're missing only 500 square feet. So things like that where
right
we want to look at the impacts of, like, what's a really small change that would A, make our lives easier in terms of permitting and stuff, and B, would just really increase the number of places where you can put these types of middle housing.
And Taylor, did we change the code to allow duplexes outright if they met this certain criteria? I know we talked about it in the R1, like if they were on a corner and that type of thing, or maybe we didn't, maybe it's just been talked. Okay.
Yeah, not yet.
Yeah, good questions on that. Matt, did you have a comment or a question? It looks like you were unmuted, so I just thought I'd check.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I really appreciate you guys, looking into this and, coming up with some solutions to this problem. I think it's a problem too, in Estacada, about not having enough, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, multifamily. I think the demand is huge in Estacada. We have a fourplex right in town, and when we have a vacancy, I put a sign up and it's rented right away. So there's definitely the demand there, but I do think there's a few things that we should point out that maybe the city doesn't have control over, that are challenges. They're going to get people to want to build here. And I don't know if we can overcome them just because of some of the restrictions. The first thing that I think, and I'm doing research on this, so I'm listening and reading. A lot of investors, people that would be building large multifamily projects or multifamily projects in general, definitely not specific to Estacada or even our county, are leaving our state because of rent controls and the state government and what they're doing to landlords. So they're just, in Oregon in general, throwing in the towel and going to other states. It's really getting tough to be a landlord and to be able to evict people, and just the rights that a property owner would have as a multifamily owner. So that's one thing that's really challenging. You know, they do these rent controls to make it more affordable, and then eventually it doesn't make it more affordable because it's limiting your supply. And that's happening greatly in Oregon. So one of our issues, can you guys still hear me? I think my screen went dead.
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Okay. The next thing, from what I'm hearing from developers, and I talked to one who's a big multifamily developer, and I'm like, you know, what about Estacada? You know, we need apartments, we need more housing, you know, that's more affordable here. Will you do it here? And they're like, nope. I'm like, well, why? I mean, the demand's here. And they say, okay, well, I can buy a piece of property, you know, for, you know, let's say $500,000 in Estacada, or I can buy it for $500,000 in Bend, and I'm going to get double the rents in Bend. So the money's following the rents a lot, just from what I'm hearing. So the one thing I think that we can do, and at least in the Estacada and the downtown core, that I think will help bring some more multifamily downtown in Estacada. And I'm thinking of, you know, an older person who wants to be able to walk to the bank, walk to the grocery store, walk to the post office, is potentially getting rid of the requirement where there's commercial on the first floor. That's, I think, been a big impediment to having multifamily in the downtown core or the riverfront commercial area. So maybe something the city should look at, but I just think that this group should, you know, yeah, we can change the zoning, but that doesn't necessarily mean multifamily is going to come down the pike.
Yeah, great comments. I think, you know, you're absolutely right that one, just changing the zoning won't guarantee something's going to happen. Two, there are some factors beyond the city's control that are kind of done at the state level. And three, I think some of the things you mentioned in terms of cost and achievable rents, it's just what Brendan was saying a little while ago. So yeah, really good comments, and good thought about the issue of requiring ground floor commercial. It's not something I think we've looked at so far, but it's something we can think about or explore. So yeah, thank you. Katie, do you have another comment or a question?
A comment, I guess, just in response to some of what Matt Day has been saying. So I actually work for a very large multifamily developer in the state of Oregon. They almost specialize in buying up land in rural areas throughout Oregon, building up these beautiful apartment complexes, renting them out within the first year of them being built, and then taking all of their profit and going and doing it somewhere else. And now they've got, I think they're up to 13 projects scattered throughout the state of Oregon. None of them are in actual Portland. That being said, the issue that he was talking about landlords sort of leaving Oregon in droves, the research that I have seen in the apartment industry, in the multifamily industry, is that statistic is mostly affecting mom and pop owners, you know, the private owners who don't do this as like a living. They sort of do it as a side income because of all the regulations that have been going on. Yeah, they're getting out of the rental market. They're saying, no, this is too difficult. We can't do this anymore. And they're moving on. But there is still so much money to be had. Personally, I now manage a market rate apartment complex in Sandy. I'm 10 minutes away from the city limits of Estacada right now, and I'm renting out 3-bedroom apartments for $2,100 a month. The money is actually in our area. If people don't know that, I can show them. I personally am renting a house in Estacada for over $1,600 a month. You know, I'm also a renter in Estacada, so. But with the ground floor commercial, I don't think that's a requirement. What we recently did was we introduced the vertical housing development zone, which is we are providing additional incentives to people who are going to redevelop property that is right now commercial, And if they redevelop that property to have residential above that commercial space, then there would be some additional incentives on that. But Taylor, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we do have a requirement that in our downtown zone that the first floor has to be commercial.
I just looked at that. You can't have downtown residential that faces Broadway or Main, but anywhere else downtown, multifamily just by itself is allowed. So it's just those buildings that face Broadway and face Main Street that have that requirement. Like Matt, where you guys built didn't have that requirement.
Yeah, and I think that might have got changed in 20 when we did the land use change.
Yeah.
So,
but anyway,
I'm not speaking everything, but like,
yeah.
Let's say that property next to Dick's Logging, you know, that 2 acres there.
Yep.
Multifamily dwellings are a conditional use provided, but the ground floor includes a commercial use permitted outright. And
I didn't look in that code, so that could be.
Yeah, so
yeah.
it's a little different. So,
but in downtown, they only have to have, it's an outright use for multifamily, and they only have to have commercial on Broadway and Main on that face. Yeah. Okay. We're slowly getting there.
Yeah. Okay.
And to clarify, Katie, some of my comments about, you know, people leaving Oregon and things like that, those were from some of the developers and people that I've spoken to. So.
Okay. Well, I would just say I appreciate all the insights and information on all that. I mean, they'll help inform, you know, us as we move forward. So thank you for both of you. Anything else on this one before we jump up to the next one? All right. So kind of a somewhat related, but another option just related to density. So one is to look at some increases in allowable density, maximum density or minimum lot size in some of your zones. Another potential strategy is to establish some minimum density requirements. The point of this would be to make sure that you do achieve a certain level of development. I think this is frankly, in some ways, most important.
Sorry about that. My scroll wheel got totally out of control. I'm going to take my hands off my mouse now.
Good idea. It's okay. Thank you. So I think, you know, in some ways, this is particularly important in higher density zones. But either way, establishing a minimum density helps ensure that residential zones are developed to their projected density. For communities that do establish minimum densities, they typically set the minimum somewhere between 50 and 80% of the maximum. And so we identified some potential minimums if you wanted to do that. We have kind of a couple of questions here. One is, should minimums for single family be different than for multifamily and common law? The other thing that, again, I think is actually to some degree more important is that in your highest density zone, your R3 zone, because you have a lack of R3 land in terms of the projected need for multifamily housing, that you establish a minimum density there, or not allow, frankly, for single family detached housing to be built in the R3 zone. Because if it is, and if it's built at lower densities than what you're projecting for the higher density development, that land supply will get eaten up pretty quickly. And you have adequate land in those lower density zones for single family detached homes or subdivisions. You know, there's supply out there. So I think that's one question is, you know, should you even allow for that form of housing in your highest density zone? So I would kind of put that question out there. And also just pose the question, you know, what do you think about establishing minimum densities where you're requiring that, you be at somewhere between 50 and 80% of the max density allowed. So any thoughts on this one? Comments or thoughts or suggestions? Melanie gave us a thumbs up. Anybody have any concerns, issues with this one? I guess maybe I'll ask it that way. Okay, we'll keep going. So the next one, we talked about this already a little bit before in relation to some of the other strategies. So one of the things you're not seeing a lot of built, and Matt Day talked about this too, that he thinks there's a demand for this type of housing. We think there's a demand for this type of housing too, beyond what you've seen developed in the past. Missing middle or middle housing, again, we're talking about duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, and again, cottage clusters. And we did an online survey earlier and we asked people, what do they think about these types of housing? Do they support more development of these? There was good support for these types of housing. But there are some challenges with your code, and Taylor talked about this earlier in terms of a couple of things. One, the lot sizes that are required for some of these forms of housing, frankly, are not particularly financially feasible. Developers are much more often going to, if they've got a choice, they're going to build a single family detached home on the same side lots as where they could build a duplex or a triplex. So that's one. And then two, if these forms of housing, if you have to go through a conditional use process to develop them, that's a pretty significant barrier to most developers. And the CHAD recommended moving towards compliance with House Bill 2001, which was adopted a couple of years ago. You all are not subject to those requirements because of the size of the city. It's those requirements apply to cities of population of 10,000 or more. And for cities population of 10,000 or more, they need to require, or they need to allow, not require, but allow a duplex to be built on any lot where a single family detached home can be built. For even larger cities, there's a number of additional requirements beyond that related to other types of middle housing, but that's kind of the minimum requirement in cities over 10,000. So we've got a couple of potential recommendations here. One is permit these types of housing by right in all residential zones. Don't only permit them as a conditional use, so that somebody doesn't have to go through that conditional use process, which is both creates cost and really, even more importantly, uncertainty for a developer who wants to build those forms of housing. And two, just reduce some of the things that we think are barriers to cost effectively building those types of housing. So those have to do with lot sizes, parking requirements, et cetera. And those get at some of the things that Brendan talked about in terms of being barriers when they looked at the pro forma analysis to being able to build these types of housing cost effectively. So that would represent, kind of a not insignificant change to what you allow in different residential zones. But we want to put that out there as something for y'all to think about. So I'll stop talking and just see if anybody has any comments, questions, concerns about this. Katie.
Sorry, but it seems like I ask a lot of questions. This one is a legit question though. How many other cities of our size or even smaller have you seen moving closer to House Bill 2001? I only ask because it does seem like a lot of people in Estacada have, at least the ones I've talked to, have sort of the NIMBY mindset. And when we talk about a housing strategy like this, again, NIMBY comes up a lot. And I guess I just want to know how many other smaller cities you've seen move closer to 2001 voluntarily.
I can mention a couple of them that we've worked in fairly recently that have moved a little closer. So one, and I will maybe preface this by saying, you know, like every community is different, and you're absolutely right that you may see pushback to this and other cities see pushback to this. But having said that, Sisters, Oregon, we're working with them right now, and we did some work with them on their comprehensive plan. And at least in terms of sort of general support, they haven't gone through the code updates yet to do some of this, but they have identified some support for sort of moving closer to implementing something that's consistent with HB 2001. We did some work in a very small community. Well, actually, it's not a ton smaller. Yeah, it's smaller than you guys, out in Morrow County, Heppner, recently. And Heppner updated its code to allow for cottage clusters, and also to reduce some of the lot sizes for duplexes in that community. So that's another one out in Eastern Oregon that's smaller than you all, that moved towards that. We talked about some similar changes in doing some work in some of the other communities in Morrow County, and also in Lincoln County as part of a couple of studies there. Those studies didn't result in actual amendments to their codes, but we did identify some similar changes, and there was some support, but those projects didn't go all the way through kind of the code amendment process. So those are a few, but it's hard for me to cite a ton of them. I think that's a really good question, but that's kind of what I can tell you so far, at least about the ones where we've worked recently. Yeah, any other questions, comments, thoughts on this one? Yeah, Anne.
I had a question, just what's the kind of community feel for adding multifamily dwellings as far as like triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, kind of in the city limits? Is there a general feel like people are accepting that they want that? I mean, I know there's a big demand. But
are you asking about kind of in Estacada or just?
Yeah, within the downtown area or close to it, within the city.
I mean, again, we did ask about that in the survey. I think there was certainly some support for and a recognition that there's a need for some of these housing types. I think there also was some, we did ask people, hey, do you think these would fit well in your neighborhood? I can't remember sort of what the percentage was that said, oh yeah, we think a triplex would fit really well, or a quadplex. I think the thing I would probably, you definitely, and you have the ability to do this, to think about applying some design standards and coming up with some lot sizes and development standards that try to help ensure a certain level of compatibility, at least in terms of kind of mass and scale of these housing forms, that's not too dissimilar from what's in the neighborhood now or what's in these neighborhoods now. That's what I would maybe be thinking about, because that's what I think a lot of times people kind of react to is the size, the scale, and the design of housing. You do need to be somewhat cautious about applying too many of those design standards to a point where you're just increasing the cost, and you're then kind of creating another set of barriers or issues. But I think really good question. There's not a perfect answer for it. That's where I would at least start out. And I think you'd want to have some more, we'll want to have, if we go further down this particular path, we're going to want to have a little more community discussion around it. So.
For sure.
Yeah, good question. But in general, what do people think about this one? Any other thoughts about it? Does it make sense? You think it's a hard no? What do you think? Anybody?
I'm just, I don't know. I spent 30 years in Southern California. And so just like the McMansion effect and like you sell a plot of farmland and then instantly there's 5,000 houses there, like 5,000 apartments there. And you, as an Estacadian, I would cringe, right? To see that just to see it change so rapidly, but of course the demand is huge.
Yeah.
So maybe like some of the smaller like cottage cluster is kind of is an attractive option because it looks like single family houses, but you're sharing a little bit of green space or common space. And townhouses, there are several, smaller units around that you just don't notice, but they're scattered around town. But one of the things I think is very interesting that you're talking about, and maybe you haven't done it yet, but just in that plan, to be able to adapt current houses to be, rentable rooms or shared spaces for existing dwellings. And I think that could be a really helpful way to accommodate that, especially more in the walking downtown area, like you mentioned, for older folks that don't maybe have a family out in the country that they can put a house on, or, have an ADU. It would be good to have some of those spaces where there's more access to facilities and walkable distance.
Yeah, good thoughts and comments. We will talk a little bit about that a little later. Conversions, allowing for conversions.
Okay.
I would say in terms of particularly the plexes, I don't think you're going to see an explosion of those, just because those do meet a certain sort of component of your overall housing need, but there's still a lot of people that want a single family detached home, frankly. So you would potentially see some more of them, but I don't think it would be like this overnight change. I think it would be kind of gradually, you'd see more of those built over time. But it's certainly a legitimate question or thing to think about. I had one other thought, but I can't remember what it was. So anyway, yeah, good thoughts. All right. Well, I heard, let's think about some things, but I didn't hear any hard no's on this one. So the next one. So you do already allow accessory dwelling units. There's a number of strategies that we think you could put in place just to, again, kind of further reduce some of the barriers to their development. So we identified those in the report. One, potentially allow some exceptions to the rear yard setbacks to allow those ADUs to be a little closer to the rear lot line. A number of communities that have kind of relaxed some of those setbacks have done it, particularly if the ADU is below a certain height. And if the ADU is above a certain height, then you still retain a little bit more of a setback. So that's something to think about. Consider some exceptions to lot coverage standards that can get in the way of being able to develop an ADU, depending on the size of the lot and the size of the existing home and the size of the proposed ADU. So that's something to think about. State law requires that you not require an additional parking space for an accessory dwelling unit. And that appeared to be not super clear in your code to us. So that's just something that you need to be sure is clear in your code per state law. So that's something we identified. You could consider allowing 2 ADUs. A number of communities around Oregon do that. You could allow like an attached and an internal, or a detached and an internal or attached ADU is one option. So that's something to think about. And then you have some design standards for ADUs that I think in our estimation don't meet what's called the requirement for all housing design standards to be clear and objective. So we pointed some of those out in the report that we think you need to take a look at updating to be sure that they are clear and objective and not subjective, or don't allow for a certain amount of discretion in terms of how they can be applied. And that's just a general state requirement or state law, is that you have a clear and objective path or set of standards for all housing in all zones. You can have an alternative path that's kind of at the option of a developer to meet a more discretionary set of standards, but you really need to apply clear and objective standards to all housing. So, so we pointed out, I don't feel like these are, again, this is something you're already doing in terms of allowing ADUs. And we're just identifying, I would call them sort of more minor changes to make sure A, you're being consistent with state law, and B, reducing some potential barriers to allowing for ADUs. The allowing to would be sort of going a step beyond, I would say. The other things are a little more minor. There's some other things that you could think about. One, reducing the SDCs, the systems development charges that you apply to ADUs, or deferring payment of systems development charges for some period of time for them. There are some communities, there's at least a couple of them that I'm aware of that have recently put together some pre-approved site or building plans for ADUs. So if somebody comes in with one of those, they're kind of good to go. They have a more expedited permitting and review process. So that's another thing you could do that's kind of not exactly a code strategy, but it's a, hey, here's a way to get these built without spending as much money on the planning and design of them. So that's another thought on ADUs. So we identified this as a relatively high priority simply because ADUs can be, they offer sort of another housing choice, and they can be kind of more affordable for smaller households, and they can provide a source of income for the existing or the current homeowner as well. So any thoughts on these? Do these make sense? Do you have concerns about any of these? Melanie.
Thank you. I have a little concern about the rear yard setback because I had a builder talk to me about that one time, and talking about building the ADU, within 5 feet of the backyard fence. I'm like, wait, you can't. That wouldn't be. It would, lower the quality of life for the neighbor. And he's like, well, no, you're not thinking about the neighbor. You're thinking about this lot right here. But the setbacks are to help the livability of the neighborhood. So I would have a concern about that one. I do see if it's like a, not a 2-story type of a thing, maybe it could be a little closer, but I have a concern about that. And then I wanted to clarify that parking. So we can't require an extra parking space for an ADU, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, some of our bigger lots in town they're in the older part of town, and some of those houses don't have any off-street parking. And so maybe Denise or Taylor already knows this, but can we require the main house to add parking for them if there's no off-street parking and they're adding an ADU?
I think the short answer is yes. Taylor or Kate, any comments or thoughts on that?
I'm not sure actually. Excuse me. This one stumped me a little bit when I was trying to figure out how it would work. Because in one sense, it sort of makes sense if, the existing parking isn't meeting, the existing dwelling doesn't meet the current parking standards, you could require the parking before the ADU goes in. But the state, rules are pretty explicit in saying you cannot require parking for an ADU. So it might be something that you would want to check either with the city attorney on, or, we could check with someone at the state for clarification on that.
Okay.
Yeah, we regularly pepper people at DLCD with questions.
I like that, yeah. That's another neighborhood livability thing, because out here we don't have, most everybody really needs to have a car. And so it's just kind of a livability thing that I would be concerned with, but we obviously have to follow state laws. So.
Okay, yeah, okay. Fair enough. All right. Next one. So another one of the recommendations from the CHAD was to look at encouraging kind of a wider range of housing types in what were identified as or called high opportunity areas. So when we kind of think about that term, generally, we think about areas that have good access to jobs, schools, grocery stores, parks, shopping areas, et cetera. And just, allowing a broader range of housing types in that kind of area promotes diversity in terms of the population and the type of housing. And so the CHAD had recommended kind of doing some analysis of the areas that are zone R1 in uptown, near downtown and schools, and looking at ways to reduce regulatory or financial barriers to a wider range of housing types in that area in particular, or those areas in particular. So this kind of frankly dovetails with some of the other strategies that we've been talking about here. It would just be more of a kind of geographic application or an area specific application of some of the things we've already talked about in terms of reducing some of the regulatory or financial barriers to developing a broader range of housing types in that area. So, and I'm going to talk about parking reductions in a little bit. And at the last TAC meeting we had, when we talked about that topic, one of the comments was, well, we might not want to look at doing that citywide, but maybe that's something we want to think about in these areas, in these high opportunity neighborhoods. So that's something to kind of put out there as well. Although we do have some recommendations in here to generally think about parking reductions. So we'll see what y'all say about that in a moment. So, all right. I'm just going to kind of keep looking to see if hands come up virtually or physically, and if not, I'll kind of keep going, but do stop me and raise your hand, or, you know, if you have a question or a comment on any of these. Otherwise, I'll just keep going.
You have 18 strategies?
I believe so. So
okay, we got to cruise.
We do have to kind of cruise, so it's okay. And it's also okay, I would say, you know, if you don't have comments today, but you dig into the memo a little bit after this meeting, yes, please do send us any additional comments you have, you know, after the meeting as well. So I promised I'd talk about parking, and here we are. So streamline or reduce off-street parking requirements. Currently, you all require 2 spaces per unit for most types of housing, single family, detached homes, duplexes, triplexes, common wall development, or townhomes. We would say that those standards can pose a barrier or a challenge to development of middle housing in particular. It simply requires more space on the lot then to develop those. If you need to provide 2 spaces per unit for a quadplex, you gotta have space for 8 parking spaces on the site in addition to the quadplex itself. The state's middle housing rules require for those medium-sized cities that allow duplexes, where they allow single-family detached homes, that you can't require. You can allow more parking, but you can't require more than 1 space per unit for duplexes. And for larger cities that need to implement additional rules or additional standards around other types of middle housing, it's kind of 1 space per unit. We think you should think about that, although we also recognize that might be a tough sell in Estacada, you know, given what we just heard from Melanie and others, but we're still putting it out there. The other thing to think about, which is what I mentioned a moment ago, is maybe you don't do this citywide, but you think about doing this in certain parts of the city, for instance, in those high opportunity areas. So we're putting that out there as a thing to think about. And Katie, what do you think?
I have a stupid question. Because I have a love-hate relationship with this particular strategy, and especially for the reasons that Melanie mentioned. Also, like I mentioned before, I'm an apartment manager in Sandy, our neighboring city, and I can tell you right now that 2 spaces per unit is pretty important in our area. But that being said, is it possible for us to have parking permits that are parking requirements that are specific to the zone? And part 2 question, is it possible to have 1.5 parking spaces be a requirement per dwelling unit, because for multifamily residential specifically? I only ask that because I would really hate to see us lower it down to 1, but I also realize 2 is a barrier, and I wonder if 1.5 would be a good compromise.
Yeah, and I would say those are absolutely not stupid questions.
Yeah,
really good questions.
We do have that now. We changed our multifamily parking to, I think it is 1.5 with so many, and yeah.
I think it's just 1 right now. But
for multifamily?
Yeah, unless
Yeah.
our code contradicts itself.
And I think that's
Fine.
partly why we didn't have a recommendation in here around multifamily. It was more around middle housing, because you're still requiring 2 per unit for middle housing and common law. But I would say for those 2, you could, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be 1 or 2. It could be somewhere in between. You know, you could say, hey, for a triplex, we're going to require 4 or 5, but not 6. Or for a quadplex, we're going to require 6, but not 8. You could, it's a little trickier with, it's a little easier to do that with the plexes, because there you've got 2, 3, 4 units on a single lot, right? But with common law housing, or, you know, I think of them as townhomes, typically each unit is on its own lot. And for that lot, it doesn't make a lot of sense to require 1.5 spaces. You could still sort of do it for a townhome development. And what that would then mean is there would need to be like some shared parking somewhere on the site within the development, so that you had, you know, like 1 space per housing unit, but some additional shared spaces. That just then kind of ends up being a little complicated for the developer, because then they've got to have kind of this common or shared portion of the development where they've got kind of easements, and the units can still be on their own piece of property and owned kind of fee simple, but it just complicates the development a little. So that's what I would say.
Or you could have 1 unit that only has 1 parking space, and then their next door neighbor has 2, and then the next one has 1, you know.
You could do that. That would be kind of weird too, but
Oh, shoot.
Katie,
I messed up my screen sharing again. Sorry about that.
okay.
I was just, I did want to add one more thing.
Yeah, go for it.
Which I'm forgetting what it was. We were talking about parking. I'll let you know if I think of what it was while I'm getting the Zoom share back going.
I just had a question for City of Estacada. What is the current parking requirements on the street? Do you allow overnight parking in all areas, or are there some restrictions in certain places? Because that makes a difference. If you can park on the street and it's close to your unit, you're good to go. But like where I live in Sandy, we're in a condo. We get 1 spot on our driveway, and then the rest is kind of shared parking. We got to figure it out, but we can't park on the street. It's restricted to 2 hours. So I just
we
wondered if
allow
Estacada-
overnight parking everywhere.
Oh, I thought so, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, no restrictions on street parking.
After 72 hours, watch out though, because we're coming for you.
Okay. Try not to leave my beater out on the park.
Yeah, exactly.
On the street. Okay.
Katie, did you have another question or comment there?
No, I didn't. I'm sorry. I'll lower my hand.
Oh, no worries. Yeah.
I remembered actually Anne's comment or question reminded me of my other comment was going to be, which was that you could continue requiring 2 off-street parking spaces for some of those housing types, but allow, if there is on-street parking that's available and that abuts the site, that could count towards the requirement. So then it would be effectively only 1 parking space as long as they have that on-street parking available. So that's another kind of in-between option.
Yeah, that is something that was kind of came up when the state was working on its middle housing model code and rules, was the ability for cities to provide a credit for on-street spaces. It was more in the context of both require only 1, but also allow for the credit, but you could require 2, but allow for the credit. So yeah, that's another good thought in terms of, and the other thing I think I forgot to respond to in Katie's question was, could you vary the requirements by zone? Yeah, you could vary the requirements by the parking requirements by zone. That would be another option, or another way to kind of provide a certain amount of nuance or variability. All right, I'm gonna keep going, because as somebody pointed out, Melanie, I think we got a bunch of these. Some of them might go a little faster than others. But we'll keep kind of cruising along. So another was to facilitate development of non-conforming lots. You have some existing undersized lots that where development is not allowed. We think at least at a certain size, you probably should allow single family dwellings on some of those non-conforming lots. In part, I would say, because if you don't, you are kind of eliminating all economic value of those lots, and you may run into some takings claims if people are sort of familiar with that concept. So that's something to think about. You could also consider allowing for duplexes on some of those lots as well, if you decide that you want to allow duplexes either on smaller lots or by right in certain zones. You know, if there is concern, and I heard some concerns about kind of the scale of buildings, you could think about limiting the percentage of the lot that's covered, so limiting lot coverage, or using what we call floor area ratio. That's what FAR stands for. Floor area ratio is basically you divide the number of square foot of the building by the size of the lot, and that gives you floor area ratio. And you can have some limitations on what that can be, and that helps control kind of the mass or the size of the building relative to the site. So that's an option. I think it makes things more complicated. It's a little harder if it's not something you're used to doing to apply or administer within your zoning code, but you know, it is something you can do. And I think, you know, if you are allowing for development on these smaller non-conforming lots, you can still have some requirements that you're meeting basic infrastructure needs. You can still have some street frontage requirements that you can't, you know, the lots can't be narrower than a certain amount, that you can still get utility hookups in there, that emergency access is not an issue, et cetera. So I think that even if you allow this or revise your regulations a little bit, you can still put some kind of protections in place to address some of those issues. So, but I do think this is probably something worth considering. We identified it as a kind of medium priority, but something to think about. So, and I think it was one of the things that came out of the recommendations from the chat as well. All right, I think this one's fairly straightforward. I think, again, you might still want to have some sideboards on it, but maybe go a little lower than what you've got now. So, all right, next one. Zoning incentives for affordable and workforce housing. I think this starts to get a little bit at Katie's question about kind of how do you hold developers accountable for providing certain things. So one approach in terms of your zoning code is simply to revise the requirements that apply to all land in a given zone. Another is to provide some specific incentives for developments that include housing that's affordable to people with low or moderate incomes. And when you do that, and when cities do that, they generally, they require that the units are sold to or rented to households in those income categories, and that they remain that way for a certain period of time. They do that then in exchange for some of these incentives. The most common incentives are either density or height bonuses, so allowing things to be denser on smaller lots, or reducing parking, the amount of parking that's required. So that's another way to think about the parking reductions. You know, you could do it everywhere, do it in certain areas, do it in certain zones, certain types of housing, or for developments that are guaranteed to be affordable to people in certain income ranges. You can also provide some flexibility in how the affordable units are provided. So it might be that, like, not all the units have to be affordable to people in those income ranges, but a certain percentage of them need to be, you know, so that's another way to think about this. I think if you wanted to go down this path, we might want to have a little more consultation with some local affordable housing developers, get a sense of, from their perspective, which of these things are going to be most valuable or most persuasive in terms of, you know, providing incentives for them to develop that type of housing. So put that out there. Is I think these can be a little bit of work to administer, but they do get right at the, like, you're giving somebody something in exchange for getting housing that's affordable to people in the income ranges you're trying to get more housing for. So any thoughts on this one? That, do you like the sound of this? Generally makes sense. See Melanie nodding in this direction. Thumbs up.
Does it come with a parking garage? Is that like hiding behind there somewhere?
Like this particular one,
Yeah, or is it just on street parking?
you know, so again, if you're in terms of, let's say the incentive is parking reduction. This one, I don't know for sure, this particular picture, but you can reduce parking or eliminate parking, and usually it's reduced. So it's like you say, okay, hey, right now for multifamily developments, we require 1 space per unit. But if these units are affordable to people in certain income ranges, maybe we drop that to half a space per unit on average, or 3/4 of a space or whatever. And in terms of where the parking is located in relation to the building, that's sort of a whole nother set of standards. So yeah.
Let's hope there's a bus that comes and takes them all to work, right? In Estacada.
Well, that's the other thing is, like, you do want to sort of think about some issues around that, or that's another way to think about reducing parking, is reducing parking in areas that have access to transit, and that's what a number of cities do. We're talking to folks in Vancouver about some changes to their code right now to do that. Yeah. All right. Next one. This one is a little bit, I'm going to say it's partly a catch-all for some of the things we've already talked about to some degree. So reducing unnecessary barriers to housing, there's a number of things that the CHAD recommended and that we've already talked about under some of the other strategies, but there's a couple of additional things that kind of we tossed in here that we didn't explicitly talk about under some of the other strategies. So we already talked about the idea of permitting duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes by right in certain zones. We talked about reducing minimum lot sizes generally. You could also do that explicitly for conversions from a single family home to more units within that home. So conversion from a single family detached home to a duplex or a triplex. We already talked about reducing parking requirements. Another thing that we'll talk about on another slide is not just thinking about reducing systems development charges or for accessory dwelling units, but also for other forms of housing or tying them to the size of the housing. So I won't say much about that now, but I'll talk more about it later. Removing conditional use requirements, talked about that in terms of that's what permitting these things by right would mean. They wouldn't have to go through that conditional use process, but you could adopt some additional standards that promote compatibility with surrounding neighborhoods or more traditional kind of single family detached homes as a way to address that. You could also think about reducing front setbacks or increasing lot coverage for allowable lot coverage for certain types of housing. I will say that that can be an issue, particularly in zones where the allowable lot sizes are somewhat smaller, but if the lot coverage requirements are also low, it makes it a real challenge to build those forms of housing in those areas. So I do think it's worth taking a look at some of your lot coverage standards. And I think we've already kind of done a certain amount of that in some of the potential code amendments that we put into the report. So that's something to think about. So this one, again, we kind of talk about a number of these in other places, but there was this specific strategy that came from the CHAD of reducing unnecessary barriers, but it kind of covers a bunch of other stuff. Kate, do you have anything to add on that? No, okay. I got it mostly right. All right. All right, let's go to the next one. So this is another incentives thing, and I just sort of referred to this. Systems development charge exemptions or deferrals. I already talked about this in the context of accessory dwelling units. You could think about this for other needed housing types as well in terms of reducing, exempting, or deferring. Deferring really just means instead of charging the systems development charge at the time of development approval, you charge it at occupancy or some other point. It really just kind of reduces the amount of time that somebody's paying interest on that money. I mean, that's kind of what it does in terms of reducing the cost of the housing. Another thing that some communities, there's a couple I know of, Newport and Prineville, have both revised their SDC methodologies to vary the SDC by the size of the house. So that has and really, you know, systems development charges are supposed to pay for the impact of new housing or growth on the cost to provide water, sewer, roads, et cetera. And typically the size of the house has a pretty direct relationship to the cost of providing those services. So that's something to think about. Not a ton of communities have done it, but some have. I talked about reducing or exempting SDCs for accessory dwelling units. One of the ideas, a couple of the other ideas that the Chad talked about were reducing or waiving SDCs for parks where existing parks are near proposed affordable or needed housing, and also tying transportation SDCs to the amount of parking that's being provided, so that, you know, if you're providing less parking, you're not or there's less parking need, there's a lower SDC. So Katie, I saw your virtual hand up a minute ago. Did you have a comment or question?
No, you answered it. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. And I would say on this slide and this strategy, kind of the first thing, particularly the exempt or defer SDCs for certain types of housing, that's something you might be able to do a little more easily. But the other types of things probably are going to require another look at your SDC and a methodology and an update to that methodology. And that just tends to be a bigger lift. So that's probably a longer term strategy in that sense, because it does require you to think about, okay, you know, what's the total set of revenue coming from SDCs, and how do you sort of mitigate the reductions and still have enough money to pay for those infrastructure improvements. So I just put that out there. All right. Next one. Okay, tax abatements or exemptions. I told Brendan I would make him talk about this one. So I'm going to turn this one over to him.
Hello.
Yep.
Hi, yeah, I will talk about this fairly briefly, but the idea behind tax abatements or exemptions for housing is that you're providing just an extra financial boost or incentive to help a developer or property owner make their project pencil out. You're increasing the feasibility. So most tax exemption programs are set for 10 years, so it can really have a good impact and move the needle on a project. Currently, the city has the vertical housing development zone in the downtown that encourages housing above commercial uses. And then the Chad is recommending that you consider the home buyer opportunity limited tax exemption, which would be in distressed parts of the city, which would be for you to sort of define at this point. But the idea there is that you're providing new home buyers an opportunity to fix up a property or improve a property, and the taxable value of the improvement itself, not the land, but the house, would be exempt for the 10-year period. So that's a good benefit as well for home ownership. There are other housing tax abatement programs available. There's a couple that are geared towards affordable housing that will provide the incentive to nonprofit developers, and then there's another one that will actually also apply the benefit to for-profit developers as long as they provide some affordable housing in their project. There's another one that is a tax incentive just for multifamily housing as long as it's close to transit routes and meets the kind of conditions of being near transit routes. So anyway, those are other programs you can consider. As I said, it is a good abate, it is a good incentive, and particularly if this city is close to being able to have some of these projects pencil out, this is the kind of thing that can just give it a little boost and get it over the finish line in some cases. So I think I'll leave it there unless there are questions about the specific programs.
Yeah, I would just echo what Brendan said and say that when we talk to folks who are building affordable housing or housing affordable to people with lower incomes, like this is a really important strategy for them, as Brendan said, to get their projects, to be able to be financially feasible. So the other thing I'd say is you can do this sort of on a like case by case basis, or you could enact some kind of ordinance that says, hey, we're going to do this for anybody that asks for it, as long as they qualify under the requirements of the state program that allows for these kind of abatements. So those are a couple of ways to think about it.
Just to add on to that even a little bit more, the programs like this with affordable housing, when projects finally move forward, they usually have a pretty complex stack of different programs they're using. Different kinds of incentives, local, state, maybe tax, low-income housing tax credits, all these things to make it viable. So any type of participation helps them build up that kind of stack of programs that they need to make those projects pencil out.
All right. Any questions or comments on this one? Probably wearing you down. We are getting close to the close to the end. We might only have 16 or 17 of these. Maybe I misspoke at 18, but we'll go to the next one regardless. So expedited development review, I'll talk about this one. There's some different things that you can do to reduce review and processing times for housing. I think you probably already have in place, because I think all cities, or maybe they're over a certain size, are required to provide shorter timelines for review of certain types of regulated affordable housing. So that's kind of one option that you may already provide. It's basically kind of reduces the 120-day maximum to 100. So that's one thing that Chad recommended, expediting permitting for city-supported housing projects or those with long-term affordability covenants. So where the developer is saying, hey, this is going to be affordable for a certain period of time, and we have things built into the kind of the deed or an agreement with the city that guarantee that. Another thing that I think they talked about was consider assigning a staff person to shepherd projects through permitting and land use processes. You guys don't have a huge staff, so I don't know exactly who that would be. I think that's the other thing about sort of expediting development review. It really depends on, look, if you're already doing that pretty quickly, there might not be a ton of room to do it further. So I think this is always worth sort of thinking about, but you have to kind of think about it critically in terms of, is it possible given your staffing resources, and how are you doing now? Is it an issue? So I would just sort of put those caveats on it as, yeah, not a bad idea, can help developers, may or may not be feasible from a staffing capacity point of view. So, all right, any thoughts, comments on this one?
Okay. I guess I would just, one thought that I do have is somewhere somewhere we might want to look at that is that in our downtown zone, there are downtown specific design standards, and there's a design review process for any development happening in the downtown zone. The code currently allows for staff to either do a staff review, just staff design review, or to have a design review committee, which I think has just been the Downtown Estacada Commission, have a committee do that design review, and then it can go through, the building permit process and stuff. But that's one place where maybe we want to make sure that all of those standards are clear and objective, and then B, take out, you know, if it's for multifamily or, you know, some kind of middle housing, take out the option for a committee to do that review, which just adds time to the whole process, and make it only a staff review.
Yeah, I think that's a good thought. And yeah, and I think that could have a meaningful impact on folks, probably. All right. All right, I'm gonna keep us moving. I think we got about 3 or 4 more of these left. So financial assistance programs, these tend to be kind of two things. One, focused on helping people stay in their homes and their sort of assistance to existing residents. They're more about like helping people manage the cost of housing versus the cost to develop housing, let's say. So there's different things to do. Rent assistance, loans for homeowners, assistance to low-cost apartment owners for repairs and upgrades. I think, you know, our estimation here is these programs can be a lot of work to administer, and there's probably limited capacity to do that at the local level in Estacada. Certainly, if there's other organizations or the county who administer these programs, the city's in support of that. The county does have kind of rehab and repair loan and assistance programs. Definitely want to kind of continue to support that, but it may be challenging, you know, for the city to actually administer its own programs around this area. However, some of the things that Chad also talked about was just kind of providing more information to folks, either links for developers to different financial resources or programs, a web page or information for people who are seeking some housing assistance in terms of like, where can you go for these types of programs if they're available at the county or through other organizations. And then just generally supporting partners as they're seeking funding or grants for affordable housing projects. So, you know, that's, I think those are all good recommendations in terms of the things the city can potentially do that are maybe more consistent with the resources that y'all have available. And then also the last one we had on here was exploring eligibility of the city or projects for different grant programs, including the Community Development Block Grant Program, and funds that are available to what are called non-entitlement communities through the state. You guys aren't big enough to be a direct entitlement community, but there are funds available for specific projects through the state in non-entitlement communities. So I think that's, you know, those are all worth looking at. But in terms of kind of a robust or something that would take you a lot of resources to administer, probably not realistic. So, all right. Next one. So tax increment financing. I told Brendan he'd cover this one too. This is also called, often called urban renewal.
Right, so tax increment financing, which you folks have in Estacada in your urban renewal district. TIF is just another word for how the sort of financing and revenue building of urban renewal works. Some programs are transitioning to using the term TIF instead, because urban renewal has a certain history to it. But so anyway, TIF funds, you know, can be used for mostly physical improvements. It can be used to form partnerships with developers. It can be used to buy key properties and things like that. And the reason that it can be useful for housing is that sometimes within the district, it is a source of money, and oftentimes cities don't have a lot of ways to directly incentivize or participate in the development process. So this is really one of those ways. It needs, if an urban renewal program is going to have a set aside for affordable housing or like mixed use or vertical housing, whatever you want to incentivize, that does eventually need to be codified in the plan, adopt a minor amendment to the plan that says we want to do these kind of projects. and allocate some money to it. The CHAD also talked about creating a new TIF district at the mill site. And that could include some housing set aside. So as that mill site looked to redevelop, you would have some dedicated funds there to help ensure that some affordable housing takes place on the site and not just market rate housing. I think that's about all I have to say on that, unless folks have specific questions.
And Katie, did you have a question on that one?
I do. Are we allowed to have more than one TIF at a time?
You are. There are limitations on it in terms of the amount of land area in the city that can be within TIF districts, and the amount of the city's taxable property value that can be within TIF districts. So you need to start by doing a feasibility study to really make sure that the areas you're looking at meet those criteria and qualify. And if they don't, then you can look at other options, such as changing boundaries of your current district, or try and finding ways to make that work.
Yeah, our current urban renewal district has a sunset date of like 2027 or something like that. And I know that we have already in the last couple of years used like $250,000 already to incentivize multifamily development, but it got us 6 multifamily units, not a big drop in the bucket, but hey, it was something that our city has used in the past that I think was successful to providing that level of incentive that we intended it to, especially in terms of multifamily development. But yeah, we've already got a TIF district right now, and I just don't know if having a second one was possible or not. So thank you for that answer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The second district and on the mill property would have some other kind of benefits to it as well, because the revenue builds off of new development. And so you'd have the opportunity to catch new tax revenue from any new sort of market rate development that happened there. And that would feed pretty much directly into urban renewal. So it's definitely something to consider.
All right, thank you. Yeah, and really good to know that you've kind of already used your existing district to incentivize some affordable housing. So that's great. So quick little time check. My clock says 5:59, so we're closing in on 6 o'clock. We've got, I think, 3 slides left, 3 slides and three strategies plus next steps. Are y'all okay? I think, we can finish up in the next 5 to 10 minutes. Are people okay with going an extra 5 to 10 minutes?
Actually, I am not going to be able to be here any longer. I'm so sorry. I've been at work for the last 2 hours, and now it's time for me to close up my office and head out of my office and actually go home, which I haven't been at since 7 o'clock this morning. So I'm actually going to be heading out the door now.
Okay, no worries. And we appreciate you being here as long as you have been, Katie, and thank you. Others, can you give us another just few minutes?
I'm in the same boat. I've got an appointment at 6, but I need to go. But thank you for including me in this.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Planning opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and Katie. Thank you, Kimberlee. I see you have to head out too. So we appreciate you guys participating.
Yeah, and I would just say, as I said before, if you do have any comments on any of these other strategies or any of the ones we've talked about, please do let us know. I think we'll just, anybody that needs to leave, thank you for being here, and go ahead, of course. And then anybody that can stay, we'll wrap it up fairly quickly, cover these last few, and then just talk about next steps, and then let you all go. So, all right, with that, so this next one, land acquisition and banking. This is really about like either obtaining or using, either obtaining sites, the city doing that, or working with others to do it, or using sites that are owned by the city or other public entities to reduce the cost, the land costs associated with housing development. And this is usually done for certain types of housing that you're trying to see happen or promote. Often this is one where you're often going to say, hey, yeah, we're going to do this, but in exchange for this housing being affordable to people in certain income ranges and for an extended period of time. So this was a recommendation of the CHAD to recommend partnerships to support the city in identifying and securing those types of sites. And you might also want to, look at the potential for any existing city-owned properties that aren't programmed or dedicated for other uses to potentially be used for affordable or workforce housing development in the future. I think that, it's probably unrealistic for you to develop some kind of complicated program to do this, but I would think about it in a more opportunistic way. If you own properties where this is an opportunity, and you make those opportunities available to somebody who commits to building the thing you want them to build, and keeping it in that kind of use for an extended period of time, I think it's probably worth thinking about. So, all right, next one, we got a twofer, public-private partnerships, community land trusts, and then construction excise tax. So public-private partnerships and community land trusts, really community land trust is sort of like a subset, I guess, in a way of a public-private partnership. Public-private partnership is really just, the public contribution to a privately managed or developed project where there's going to be some public benefit. And so it refers to some of the things we've already talked about, land acquisition, et cetera. You can help pay for the cost of public infrastructure improvements, again, in exchange for the development being including units affordable to people with lower incomes or moderate incomes. Community land trust is a certain type of organization. Typically it's a nonprofit. They own the land, and they then can establish certain pricing, either for sale or ownership pricing for their residents, and it enables that long-term affordability of that. And there are community land trusts that do this with both kind of owner-occupied, well, it's almost always some kind of owner-occupied housing, but different forms of that. So if there are, I don't know if there are community land trusts right now working in Estacada. One of the ones that works in different communities around the state is Proud Ground, and they tend to focus on kind of smaller projects and ones that include owner-occupied housing. So just kind of supporting them, those kind of organizations, is what this one's kind of all about. And there's other types of organizations you can support. The County Housing Authority, if there's any faith-based or other community-based organizations that are trying to develop affordable housing, and there's ways for you to support them in doing that. That's kind of what that one's about. And then the last one, construction excise tax. So this is a tax on new construction. The tax can be between 1% and 3%. The revenues from the tax are then used to help pay for the implementation of various affordable housing strategies. There are some fairly specific requirements in terms of how that revenue can be spent, and what types of programs and activities it can be used for. The CHAD did not recommend pursuing this at this time, but we still wanted to include it on the list, in part to note that it was something they looked at, didn't recommend moving forward with. So we're just kind of putting that out there. So we identified, because of that recommendation, we identified this as a relatively low priority, the CET, but it is out there as something you could look at in the future, in terms of a way to help pay for or a funding source for supporting affordable housing, or for helping defer things like reductions in SDCs, et cetera. So, all right. Any thoughts or comments on these last couple? I've definitely worn you down, I feel. All right.
No, I kind of wish that Katie was still on for the CET thing, but because she's kind of proponent of that, but we may hear from her.
All right. Yeah, maybe encourage her to, if she has some thoughts on that one, to kind of weigh in on it after the fact, she can send us
Yeah.
any. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it was also, maybe I shared this with you guys before, but that Chad meeting, we were missing like the attendees we were missing were like the houseless services representative, the affordable housing developer, like all of the kind of affordable housing advocate side. And I think that was the meeting that Katie also was not at. And so it's kind of like, yeah, they didn't recommend it, but there's a little sort of asterisk caveat there. Anyway.
Yeah, so we can revisit that, that priority rating and that recommendation if people think that's a good idea. Just let us know.
Yeah, that's definitely something that hopefully the council will either confirm that they still think it's low priority or let us know something different.
Yeah, that's a good sort of reminder to ask them about that directly. Okay. All right. Next one. So next steps. Well, actually, even before community meeting number 2, we're going to be doing a briefing with City Council later this month, towards the end of this month, February 28th. Yeah. And so, any comments, changes that came out of this meeting, we'll do a revised draft of the report. Our goal is to get that out to them pretty early, at least by our standards. So like at least a couple of weeks before the meeting, so they have plenty of time to review that, and then talk to them as well and see if they have any comments on priorities, on, questions, comments on any of these recommendations or strategies. Then we are planning for a community meeting in early March. Our goal is to do that in person, but of course that's going to depend on, the sort of trajectory of the pandemic and what the city's policy is around in-person meetings at that time. So we'll need to make some kind of call or decision on that probably in the next couple of weeks, and decide, can we do that in person, or is that going to be done online through some kind of online open house or survey, similar to what we did kind of in the early stage of this project. So after that, we'll further refine the strategy recommendations, including providing for a number of the development code related strategies, some proposed development code amendments. For the things that aren't code related, what we would do, particularly for the higher priority strategies, is give you a little more guidance on, okay, here are some of the specific actions or steps the city would need to undertake to implement those strategies. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we'll draft a set of comprehensive plan amendments, particularly for the policies, but also some narrative that you can include in your comp plan to generally describe housing conditions and needs and strategies in Estacada. And we'll have TAC meeting 4, and I think actually 5 before we're all done. But TAC meeting 4 would be to review the revised set of recommendations and strategies. We haven't picked a date for that yet. Our schedule showed that sort of late March. I think it's probably looking more like April or sometime in April for that meeting, but we'll get back to you with schedule for that. So that's kind of it for next steps. So, and I'm 10 minutes, I told you we try to end by 6. It's 6:10. So thank you for your patience, and appreciate you sticking with us this long. And anything else for the good of the order before we let you go? All right. Well, thank you.
That's a lot of information. So thank you very much for
Thank you,
going
Matt.
over it all.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for bearing with us. I know it was a lot of
Thank you.
information. So,
Yeah.
all right. Take care.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.